The dusty windshield of my old truck framed a view I didn't recognize. I had been gone for exactly 365 days, serving a research contract in the remote wilderness of the Yukon. Out there, the world was simple: ice, trees, and silence. I had survived on canned beans and satellite pings, dreaming of the day I'd return to my quiet, inherited slice of heaven in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. My grandfather had left me 40 acres of prime, rolling meadows. It was the kind of land that looked like a painting. I had left it as an empty field, save for a small, weathered shed where I kept my tools. But as I rounded the final bend of Miller's Creek Road, the sight that met my eyes made me slam on the brakes so hard the tires screeched. Where my rolling hills used to be, there was a gated entrance with a gold leaf sign that read, "The Pinnacles at Oak Ridge." Behind that gate stood 5 massive, pristine mansions, stucco, glass, and stone monsters that looked like they belonged in a celebrity magazine. "What in the hell?" I whispered, my voice cracking from disuse. I pulled up to the gate. A security guard in a crisp navy uniform stepped out of a booth. "Can I help you, sir?" "This is a private community," he said, eyeing my mud-caked truck with a look of pure disdain. "I'm Elias Thorne," I said, leaning out the window. "And you're standing on my driveway. Sir, this is the property of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. If you don't have a visitor's pass, I'm going to have to ask you to turn around." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I reached into my glove box, pulled out the deed to the land wrapped in plastic and signed by the county clerk, and held it up. "Call your manager. Better yet, call the president of this HOA. Tell them the landlord is home." The meeting took place an hour later in the clubhouse, a building that looked like a French chateau. Sitting across from me was Marcus Vane, a man whose tan was as fake as his smile. He was the president of the HOA and, as I soon learned, the developer who had authorized the project. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus began, folding his manicured hands, "there has clearly been a massive administrative oversight. We were under the impression this land was part of the adjacent parcel we purchased from the county tax sale. The county doesn't sell land that has the taxes paid 3 years in advance." "Marcus," I said, sliding a receipt across the table, "I paid the taxes before I left for the Yukon. You didn't do an oversight. You did a land grab thinking the eccentric hermit who owned it would never come back or wouldn't have the teeth to fight you." Marcus's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned to ice. "Look, we've already sold these homes. They are valued at $4 million each. The infrastructure is in. The families are moved in. We are willing to offer you a very generous buyout. Name a price. Within reason, of course." I looked out the window. One of the mansions had a massive infinity pool that literally cut into the hillside where my grandfather used to take me to watch the hawks. They hadn't just built on my land. They had scarred it. "I don't want your money, Marcus. I want my land," I said quietly. "That's impossible," he scoffed. "You'd have to tear down $20 million worth of real estate. No court will grant an injunction for that. They'll just force a settlement." "Maybe," I said, standing up. "But until then, you're trespassing. All of you." I walked out, but I didn't go to a hotel. I went to see an old friend from high school, Sarah Jenkins. She was a property lawyer who had a reputation for being a pit bull in a silk suit. When I showed her the photos and the deed, she actually whistled. "Elias, they didn't just build on the edge of your property. They built the entire neighborhood's core infrastructure, the private road, the sewer lines, and 5 luxury homes directly in the center of your plot. They skipped the survey because they were rushing for the market peak." "What are my options?" I asked. Sarah grinned. "In this state, property rights are king. Since you never gave permission and they acted in bad faith by ignoring the lack of a clear title, you have them by the throat. We aren't going for a buyout, Elias. We're going for a lease." The next month was a blur of legal filings, shouting matches, and frantic phone calls. The HOA tried to sue me for obstruction. They tried to claim adverse possession, which Sarah laughed out of court because I hadn't been gone long enough. The turning point came during the preliminary hearing. Sarah stood up and presented a document that made the HOA's legal team turn gray. "Your Honor," Sarah addressed the judge, "my client does not wish to displace the families living in these homes. He is a reasonable man. However, the Oak Ridge, HOA is currently occupying 40 acres of private land without a lease. Since the buildings cannot be moved and my client refuses to sell the land that has been in his family for 3 generations, we have filed a motion for fair market rent. The judge looked at Marcus Vane. Mr. Vane, did you or did you not build these homes without a certified survey of the Thorn parcel? Marcus stammered. We had a preliminary report. That's a no, the judge snapped. Mr. Thorn, what are you asking for? I stood up. I had thought about this a lot. I didn't want to be a villain, but I wanted justice for the land they had paved over. I want the HOA to pay me monthly. Rent for every square foot of my land they are occupying, I said. And since these are luxury estates, I expect the rent to reflect the luxury market. Furthermore, I want a seat on the board with a veto, power over any environmental changes to the remaining undeveloped acreage. The judge nodded. Given the egregious nature of the trespass, I find the request for a ground lease to be the only equitable solution, short of total demolition. The aftermath was glorious. The HOA was forced to sign a 99-year ground lease. Because the mansions were built so high-end, the fair market rent for the land underneath them was astronomical. Each of the 5 homeowners who were now furious at Marcus Vane for selling them unclear titles had to pay a portion, but the bulk of the weight fell on the HOA's reserve, funds, and Marcus's development company. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of a brand-new cabin I had built on the far north corner of my property, the part the developers hadn't touched yet. It was modest, made of cedar and stone, and it faced the sunset. A sleek black SUV pulled up the gravel path. Marcus Vane stepped out looking significantly less polished than he had months ago. He was no longer the president of the HOA. The homeowners had ousted him in a landslide vote and were currently suing him for fraud. Elias, he said, nodding stiffly. Marcus, I replied, sipping my coffee. You're late with the check. It's the 5th. He reached into his pocket and handed me an envelope. The board is asking if you'd consider a lump sum settlement again. The monthly payments are killing the association's budget. They can't afford the landscaping anymore. I looked out at the pinnacles. The grass was getting a little long. The gold leaf sign at the front gate was starting to peel. I like the monthly payments, Marcus, I said. It reminds me every 30 days that some things aren't for sale. Besides, I'm using the money to buy up the timber lot on the other side of the ridge. I'm going to turn it into a nature preserve. No mansions allowed. Marcus looked defeated. You're ruining the prestige of the neighborhood. No, I countered. I'm just the landlord. And as your landlord, I'm telling you that you're parked on a no-parking zone. Move the car, Marcus. As his SUV kicked up dust leaving my property, I leaned back in my chair. The sun was dipping below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. A hawk circled overhead, the same way they used to when I was a kid. I had come back after a year to find a nightmare of concrete and greed, but I had turned it into a legacy. The mansions were still there, gleaming in the twilight, but they were sitting on my dirt. And every month, those who thought they could own the world had to send a little piece of it back to the man they tried to erase. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind through the pines. The land was still mine, and now it was paying me to stay that way. The following spring, the Thorn Nature Preserve officially opened. I used the rent money from the first 6 months to hire a team of ecologists to restore the creek that the construction had partially diverted. We planted native wildflowers and built a small education center for the local school kids. The residents of the mansions had a choice. They could be angry, or they could enjoy the view. Surprisingly, most chose the latter. The families in the houses, the ones who hadn't known about Marcus's shady dealings, actually became my allies. They realized that having me as a landlord meant no one could ever build more houses in their backyard. I was their buffer against further overdevelopment. One evening, one of the homeowners, a woman named Clara who lived in Mansion 3, walked up to my cabin with a bottle of wine. I hated you at first, she admitted, sitting on my porch steps. I thought you were some greedy guy holding us hostage. And now? I asked. Now I see the hawks, she said, gesturing to the sky. If Marcus had his way, there would be 50 more houses down there. My mortgage is a headache and the ground rent is steep, but I'm paying for the silence. Thank you for not selling out, Elias. We sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies emerge from the tall grass. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had gone away to find peace in the frozen north, only to find the real battle and the real peace waiting for me right where I started. The mansion stood as a monument to human ego, but the land beneath them remained ancient, patient, and unyielding. I was just the steward, the guy who came back to make sure the dirt was respected. As the moon rose, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and the wild forest alike, I felt a deep sense of completion. The year I spent away had been hard, but the homecoming had been a reckoning. I was home, the hills were safe, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked as wide and open as the valley below.